Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Cruise Altitude, a light-hearted look at the world of aviation from the other side of the cockpit door. I'm Si.
And I'm John.
Coming up this week, we delve into how pilots stay sharp at the pointy end, we talk champagne again, and more from the mailbag. So John, what have you been up to since our last episode?
Well, I've been quite busy actually. It's that time of the year again where I have to get in the simulator, so I've been studying for my 6 monthly sim check.
Ah, that's interesting. We've had loads of questions in on pilot training, so maybe we'll talk about that more later on.
Yeah, and then other than that, I've been, making the most of the nice weather really. So I've been out in the garden getting some stuff planted before the winter hits.
What kind of stuff?
Oh, well, you wouldn't believe it, but I've planted a palm tree this week.
You've planted a palm tree? Despite warnings in our previous podcast, you have gone ahead and planted a palm tree in your garden.
Well, yeah, but I'm pretty sure that I won't get coconuts growing on it, not in the English climate anyway.
Well, don't say you weren't warned. So aside from gardening, John, there's been an awful lot going on in the news. And I know you've been keeping a really close eye on that. So what have you picked up?
There's been a lot of news surrounding aviation recently, but the big bit that I picked up on was a study done by IATA. I don't know if you saw that at all, Si.
I've seen this. I can't say I read the whole thing.
So IATA stands for the International Air Transport Association, and they're a trade association that represent about 290 of the world's airlines. It's quite a lot, so it equates to about 82% of total air traffic. And what they do is they look at lots of different areas of aviation activity and they help formulate industry policy on any sort of critical aviation issues. So they commissioned a study into COVID transmission on aeroplanes.
And this was all to try to kind of help people understand the risks involved in air travel and how COVID has impacted or not flight safety, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So they've got a guy called Dr. David Powell, who is the IATA medical advisor. And what he said was the risk of a passenger contracting COVID-19 while on board appears very low. And to break it down, he looked into the numbers and he worked out that they've only had 44 identified potential cases of in-flight related transmission on aeroplanes. 44,
is that all?
Yeah, 44, and that is amongst about 1.2 billion travellers. And so to put that into context, that's about one case in every 27 million travellers up until current date. And critically, what he did say is even if you underestimate the cases, and they sort of worked on the basis that perhaps say 90% of COVID cases go unreported, but even if at that level, then it still equates to only 1 in every 2.7 million travellers. So what IATA is saying is that they think that's extremely reassuring. They also said, and I think this is quite crucial, that the vast majority of published cases occurred before airlines made the wearing of face coverings mandatory.
Yeah, I think what's really important here to be clear on, John, is that those 44 cases are cases of COVID-19 that were reported in which transmission is thought to have been associated with a flight journey. So that's inclusive of confirmed, probable and potential cases that were contracted whilst actually physically on an aeroplane. So 44 is very, very small number, isn't it? Given the 1.2 billion travellers that were thought to have travelled during that period.
Yeah, exactly. So on top of the IATA study, the major manufacturers, so I know specifically Airbus, Boeing and Embraer, have also been conducting lots of their own research into this. And they all use slightly different methodologies. But essentially what they did is use something that they call computational fluid dynamic research.
That sounds fancy.
Yeah, well, it kind of picks up a little bit on what we talked about in the last episode, which was these HEPA or HEPA filters. So basically, to make it simple, the manufacturer's simulations confirmed that aircraft airflow systems do control the movement of particles in the cabin, and that therefore then limits the spread of viruses. So what IATA is saying is almost that the way in which COVID is being suppressed in aviation is by having this sort of multi-layered approach. And so like most things in flying, we talk about having safety barriers and lots of different levels that mean it, make accidents very unlikely. And it's the same with COVID transmission. So for example, wearing masks on aeroplanes, management of queuing systems in the airport, because that was identified as an area where you could have transmission. So limiting the face-to-face interactions that passengers have in the airport, but also on the aeroplane. And also they picked up on the HEPA filter thing. They showed that 99.9% efficiency rates at removing viruses such as COVID. So I thought that was really positive news around the industry. And I mean, certainly here in the UK at the moment, it's November 2020, we're back in lockdown and travel isn't really possible at all. And international travel for pleasure is banned. But as we come out of the winter and we're all desperate to get away on holiday, then I thought that the IATA study was quite reassuring, really.
Yeah, it is reassuring, and it probably backs up our suggestion previously that we're much safer to be airborne on an aircraft than we are in your back garden under your palm tree.
Exactly that. So I thought that was some really good news that we had recently.
Excellent. Cool.
So this week I've been doing some training in the simulator, and we've had lots of you asking about the training we undertake as airline pilots. So we've got a great feature coming up in a future episode about learning to fly and initial pilot training. But in this episode we're going to have a look at recurrent pilot training. So that's the stuff that we do every year to keep us on top of our game. And I know that's something we've had quite a lot of questions about already, haven't we?
Yeah, it is, John. It's something we get an awful lot of questions about, and we've had quite a few over the last few weeks. Staying sharp at the pointy end. That is essentially what we're talking about here. It's all about recurrent training, and that's something that in the airline industry we do loads of. Our recurrent training is largely stipulated by our airline regulators. So in the case of the UK, that would be the Civil Aviation Authority, or in the United States, it would be the FAA. And what they do is they set out certain amounts of training that we have to do either annually or biannually to comply with all their regulations. So there's loads of different types, but the key element of training that we do as pilots all the time is simulator training. So as you said, John, you've just been in the simulator. How long have you been in for?
So I was in for 2 days, and it was 4 hours on each of the 2 days, so 4 hour session both days.
Right, yeah, so that's pretty commonplace among many airlines. It does vary a little bit, but broadly it's normally 2 days, back to back, and probably 4 hours on each day, and that happens twice a year. So they're 6 monthly checks, and they tend to be split into two categories. So normally one of the 6 monthly checks will be what we call the license proficiency check, which is a little bit like a revalidation of your driving license.
So that's the check I've just done this time.
Okay, so like I say, it's a bit like taking a driving test, isn't it? So for example, we would go in and do our equivalent of a parallel park, which may be an engine failure, or we might do an equivalent of an emergency stop, so, well, ejected takeoff, I suppose. And we would tick off all of those elements, and we'd have to make sure that we complete those elements to certain set standards and criteria by the regulators.
Yeah, so I guess that's about showing the regulator that you've still got the skills to do the things that you did to get your license in the first place.
Exactly. And then the second simulator session that we'll do, so in the kind of other 6 month rolling cycle, is more of a scenario based exercise. So it's supposed to simulate a normal flight, but unlike most normal flights, stuff will happen, and that stuff could be quite easy to deal with, or it could be quite difficult to deal with. And you're basically left to, as a crew, react to whatever you're faced with and deal with it the best you can. And that's designed to not only test our actual flight skills, but also our sort of what we call non-technical skills. So things like our decision making, our ability to problem solve, our failure management. And essentially what the target of that exercise is really to follow this simulated normal flight sequence, deal with whatever's thrown at us, and largely get the aircraft on the ground as safely as possible. And that really is the point of
Yeah,
the
and I guess
exercise.
the key thing about that one is that aeroplanes these days are so safe, really. Things don't, and so reliable. Things don't tend to go wrong that often. So having the simulator is a great training tool, isn't it, to allow us to replicate things that could happen in the real world, but in reality are actually pretty unlikely.
Exactly, yeah. So, for example, how many engine failures have you had in real life, John?
Oh, I've had none.
Yeah, normie. How many have you had in a simulator?
Hundreds.
Exactly. So, in that sense, what we're trying to train in the simulator is a competence to make sure that we are both competent and confident at dealing with something that is very, very, very unlikely to happen. But if on the day it does happen, we are ready to deal with it and make sure that we end up with a safe and successful outcome.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there with the word train, because we talk a lot about recurrent checking. I think that's quite a big part of pilot training, isn't it? Of being checked to make sure that you're achieving that standard. But also, probably an even bigger part is using it as a training tool, so as an opportunity to learn. And that's something that I think as pilots we do a lot, don't we? We learn from each other, we learn from past experiences of other people, of our own experiences, and then using the simulator as a tool to bring all that together is a really good opportunity, isn't it?
I think what else is interesting here, John, is that we spend an awful lot of time as pilots doing study. So we might sit there on a quiet day in the cruise, having a flick through some of our manuals, just making sure that we keep on top of our game, really. And I think that's fairly unique to airlines, or I would certainly say that airline training and pilot training is a little bit ahead of the curve with regards to some other industries. The amount of recurrent training that we go through and the levels that we are regulated to are probably in advance of some other industries, and a lot of other industries are catching up. And there are some industries out there that have signed off professionals once they come out of, say, university or an apprenticeship, and said, here you go, here's your license. And from that point on, they are never checked again. And only when perhaps they make a mistake or something gets highlighted do they turn around and go, maybe this is a good opportunity for people to learn, or maybe we should do some training. And actually, airline training and training models have now been put into other industries, such as hospitals, for example, and now they're using the methodologies that we use in airline training to improve services elsewhere. So, time to dip into the mailbag for the first time this week and see what we've got in there.
Whoa. Right, so before we get into the mailbag, I want to pick you up on something. So last week, we had a listener's question, perfectly reasonable question, about which was the hardest place to land an aeroplane. And your answer was Nantes.
Yes.
So what do you got against Nantes?
Well, nothing against Nantes per se. I think my answer was very much focusing on the actual runway in Nantes and not Nantes per se, which I will admit is one of the more straightforward places to actually fly to. But I would like to point out that the runway in Nantes does look a little bit like the Alps, and that's why it's a very difficult place to actually land than a difficult place to fly into. And if you want to prove my point, I'll put a little photo of Nantes runway in the show notes, and you can have a look at it and you'll see what I was on about.
Well, we don't want to offend anyone from Nantes, though. So in the interest of a bit of positivity around Nantes, did you know that Nantes was the birthplace of one of the most famous novelists of all time?
I did not know that.
Very good. Do you know who he is?
Not a clue.
Well, I'll give you a clue because you haven't got one. So think travel. Seeing as our podcast's about travel and flying, think travel. It's along those lines.
Christopher Columbus?
Was he a novelist? Did he a book I wasn't aware of?
Was he French?
So if you had a spare 80 days...
Michael Palin?
No, not Mike, no. Close. Michael Palin did travel the world in 80 days, but he's definitely not from Nantes. So sorry, Michael, if you are listening. I doubt you are, but you never know.
I need another clue.
No, the famous author from Nantes is in fact Jules Verne.
Of course.
Around the World in 80 Days and Journey to the Centre of the Earth. But yes, Jules Verne is from Nantes.
Well, while we're on the subject of picking ourselves up on things, John. Last week we had a very interesting discussion about champagne corks. At which point you suggested that there was a such thing as American champagne.
Which there is, yeah.
Well, there is actually. So I looked into this and I thought, I've never heard of American champagne because champagne, I thought, came from Champagne. So therefore, France. But turns out you can have American champagne. And due to some complications surrounding the Treaty of Versailles post-war, which America didn't sign, by the way, anybody who used the trademark of, or the trading name of champagne in the USA, post the 2006 wine trade agreement with the USA and France, is still allowed to use champagne on their bottle as effectively grandfather rights. But anybody who now tries to make fizz in America, they need to call it American sparkling wine. So there you go. Anyway, while I was researching your American champagne fiasco, I came up with some other interesting facts. You'll like this. How many bubbles per second do you think an average champagne glass emits?
I'm going to go
Would you like some options?
Yeah, give me some options.
Okay, is it 3, 30, or 300?
300.
Don't be ridiculous. Every second, 30.
Oh, I thought you said every minute. Every second. Oh, every second I'd have said 30, yeah.
Always read the question. Also, France has the largest champagne market, obviously, in the world. The French consume about 52% of the entire world production of champagne. Do you know how many bottles a year that is?
Oh, it's got to be...
Would you like some options?
Yeah, go on.
Is it 75 million bottles a year, 162 million bottles a year, or 220 million bottles a year?
I'm going to go in the middle. 162.
162 million bottles a year, correct. That's a lot of champagne.
It is.
So John, back to the actual mailbag after all of that. If you do want to send us questions, then you can log on to the website, cruisealtitude.com, send us an email at cruisealtitude@outlook.com, or indeed leave your questions on our Facebook page or on Twitter. Our first question comes from James in Oxford. Thanks for your question, James. And he says, what is potentially the longest flight you can do on a single tank of fuel?
Right, good question, James. Well, that's quite a tricky one to answer, actually, because obviously a lot can depend on, well, the size of the aeroplane for a start and the size of the fuel tanks it's got. So what we are seeing these days is a lot of the world's airlines using some of the newer generation of aircraft. So things like the Airbus A350 or the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, using those aircraft on their longer routes. So they might not necessarily be as big as something like a Boeing 747 or an Airbus A380, but they can fly a lot further because they have they're a much lighter aeroplane, and therefore they can carry more fuel.
Yeah, and interestingly, the record was just broken, wasn't it, or reset, however you want to look at it, for the longest flight.
It was. So right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, one airline has just recommenced service of what is now the world's longest flight. So this, I believe, is done by mileage, and it's a flight from New York JFK to Singapore, and it covers
That's a long way.
It is 9,536 miles to be exact, and it takes around about on an average day 18 hours and 40 minutes, obviously dependent on the winds. Initially, you arrive, because of the time difference, you actually arrive 2 days after you leave.
That's going to take me a while to get my head around that.
Yeah, it's a heck of a long time on an aeroplane, put it that way. And that's operated by one of the newer generation of aircraft, an Airbus A350. And Airbus are actually saying that those aircraft have the longest capability of any aircraft flying today. So they can fly for, I think it's up to 9,700 nautical miles non-stop. So to put that into context, that would be about 20 hours of flying time.
So actually, this longest flight isn't far off the maximum range.
The reason that aeroplanes can operate such long routes these days is because of great advances that have been made in fuel efficiency of the engines, but newer technology, and also because a lot of these newer aeroplanes are made of composite materials, which makes them lighter. And if you've got a lighter aeroplane, it means you can carry more fuel, and therefore you can fly a bit further.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what is relevant here with, and this maybe doesn't necessarily answer James's question, but it's the reason why the flight you've just told us about is the longest, is because airlines are not going to start flying planes just for the fun of it, and a flight has to make some element of commercial sense. So that's the longest flight that makes commercial sense. So it could be possible to fly longer with no cargo or no passengers, but let's face it, what's the point? And also crew operating hours can be quite limiting as well, because after a while we get tired too, believe it or not. So the flight that we picked up on here, to answer James's question, is the longest commercial flight that is currently happening. Yeah,
and I guess as well it depends on as you say, commercial things, but also, do people really want to sit on an airplane for 20 hours without getting off? It's an awful long time.
Depends what seat I'm sitting in.
Well, yeah, that is true, to be fair. Did you know though? So on the opposite of that, world's shortest flight. Any ideas on that one, Si?
Not a clue.
So I should tell you, the world's shortest flight is just 1.7 miles. This is the world's shortest commercial flight that's regularly operating. And it's 1.7 miles, which is 2.7 kilometres. It takes 1 minute and 30 seconds. And that's between Westray and Paparestray in the Orkney Islands. So there you go.
Wow, that's pretty quick.
Two extremes.
No time for your gin and tonic on that one.
No, definitely not.
Brilliant, Lou. Thanks very much for your question, James. Our second question today comes from Georgie, who is from Camborne in Cornwall. Thanks very much for your question, Georgie. Georgie asks, is it random who you fly with, or are all the captains and first officers paired together? So this really is an airline-specific question, because every airline rosters its crews slightly differently. But I guess the broad answer to this question is it's pretty random, John.
Yeah, I suppose in the smaller airlines with maybe one or two aeroplanes, you may end up flying with the same people all the time. But in some of certainly in the bigger airlines all around the world, you would generally expect as a pilot that every day you go to work, there's a fair chance you'll be flying with someone that you haven't flown with before.
Yeah, so your roster patterns can be quite random. So it's not really a case of, well, John and Si do the Tuesday afternoon Malaga every week. It can be completely random.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's touching back on the thing you were talking about earlier with sim training. That's another aspect of the training that we go through. So it's the training, learning to be able to work with different people. And as a result of that, we have what we call standard operating procedures. So each airline will have a set of procedures that all the pilots are trained in. They know them inside out, and they'll use those procedures to operate the aeroplane. So the idea being that you could sit next to a complete stranger that you've never met, and you know exactly what he's going to do next, or he or she is going to do next, and he or she knows exactly what you're going to do next. So it enables us to work together, even though we might have only just met each other 10 minutes earlier in the crew room.
Yeah, and what's quite interesting about this, and I certainly found quite odd when I first entered the industry, is that when you turn up and you start work, or report as we would call it, you will often meet your colleague who you're going to spend the day with or the next few days with, and there's a very good chance you've never met them before, and then you're going to basically lock yourselves in a box and spend hours, if not days, with this individual. And then at the end of that day or several days, you'll pretty much say goodbye to that person, and there's a very good chance you might never see them again. So it's a very kind of intense period of time that you can spend with somebody, and sometimes that can be really odd. Yeah,
and I guess that again, going back to how each individual airline does it, that will be impacted on by the airline's recruitment procedures. So generally, airlines will look for a certain type of person or a certain fit for their company, and that's what they'll look for. So you generally tend to find that we all get on very easily, and we all just get the job done. But also, we're quite social people, and we're able to socialise with each other and just get along, basically.
Yeah, we all have generally similar sort of interests, and we find it fairly easy to get on.
Good question, Georgie. Go on. We got time for one more, I think. Si.
We've got one more. Great question, by the way, Georgie. Thanks very much for that. Last question comes from Ray from Bognor Regis. Ray asks, how after landing do you slow the plane down?
That's a good question. Bognor Regis, incidentally, sunniest place in Britain. Did you know that, Si?
That's a great fact.
Well, there you go. You know it now. Sunniest place in Britain, apparently, Bognor Regis. So good place to grow palm trees.
Dangerous.
Hi, Ray. Hope you're catching a tan. So good question. So, well, I suppose you could approach this from a three-pronged attack on this question. There's three main ways in which a modern jet airliner will slow down when we land. The first would be conventional wheel brakes, like you have on your car. The second is something called reverse thrust, which I'm sure you've all heard of, or I'm sure you've all heard when you've been travelling on an aeroplane. And the third would be spoilers. So with regards to brakes, it tends to be the main wheels on the aeroplane that are braked. So the wheels...
So they're the ones under the belly of the aircraft, not the ones not the nose wheel, basically.
Yeah, exactly that. Because they touch down first, it's there that the brakes are applied. It's those wheels that the brakes are applied to. But we also have some other things that help make those brakes more efficient. And the first one is something called reverse thrust. So that's where the thrust that's coming in the engine, it does what it says on the tin. We reverse the direction of that thrust. So when you land on an aeroplane, you quite often hear an increase in the engine noise, and that's exactly what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reverse thrust can be modulated depending on how much we need, and it's kind of a trade-off between the other braking devices that we've got. So if it's a particularly short runway, or the runway is wet or covered in snow, for example, then we may choose to use full reverse thrust. Or if the runway is really long and the weather conditions are good, then we might choose to use just reverse idle. Yeah,
exactly that. And reverse thrust will only be applied once you know that the aeroplane is safely on the ground and the wheels are down, and it helps reduce the energy that those brakes need to use. But there is one aeroplane, I believe, that I think only one that I can think of anyway, that you could apply reverse thrust in the air on. Any ideas on that one? Yeah.
You could apply reverse thrust in the air?
Yes, on this aeroplane, and it was quite a clever system. They used it on this particular aircraft to help increase the braking efficiency, obviously, but it helped it to be able to land on shorter runways. Any ideas?
I've got no idea, but I'll have a guess. I'll use my usual guess. Is it Trident?
It is indeed Trident, the old Hawker Siddeley Trident. So the Trident was famous because you could actually select reverse thrust in the air. So it was, I wouldn't say commonly done, but sometimes done on short finals just before you touch down on the runway. You would select reverse thrust, and that would actually slow the airplane down a little bit before it touched down, which means that it didn't need to have quite as big or as powerful brakes on the wheels. There you go, bit of trivia for you. So reverse thrust forms at the second part of the braking, and the third way we slow the airplane down is using spoilers. So next time you're on an airplane, if you look out the window, if you sat over the wing, you'll probably notice some panels rise on the top of the wing, and that's to help slow us down. So
spoilers, John, just to be clear, not to be confused with flaps which come out behind the wing, but they're basically doors that pop up and in technical terms, spoil the airflow above the wing, which help us slow down.
So the way they work is a little bit like if you were to put your hand out the window when you're driving your car, you'll feel some air resistance. And that's essentially what they're doing. They're disrupting the airflow over the wing, slowing the airplane down. They're also dumping lift, so putting more pressure on the wheels, which makes the brakes more effective. Those three things combined, so brakes, reverse thrust and spoilers, are generally what we use to slow the airplane down.
Yeah, some aircraft have some really clever systems that allow the pilots to, before they've even landed, in their kind of planning for the landing, work out how much runway they need and also where they want to exit the runway, and it can modulate all of that braking to allow the aircraft to exit the runway at a certain point in the most efficient braking manner.
Yeah, exactly. And as pilots, something we do before we land, obviously, is calculate how much distance we need to stop, and we calculate where we want to vacate the runway. But yeah, some of the new aircraft, I think the Airbus A380 is one of them, and I think the A350 as well, will actually do that for you. So you make the calculation, and then you tell the airplane where you want to stop, and the airplane will modulate the braking so as to make sure it uses braking in the most efficient way.
Yeah, and that has the added benefits of saving on brake wear. It also keeps brake temperatures lower. It can reduce the noise output from the aircraft on landing, which is always of good benefit. And what it can do is then mean that the turnaround time of the aircraft and the time required on the ground for the brakes to cool can be less, which is obviously beneficial.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think of the weight of something like an Airbus A380 double-decker long-range airliner, to slow something of that size down takes a lot of braking energy, and obviously with that comes heat. So by having these really clever systems, it enables the pilots to make sure the brakes don't get too hot, and then the airplane can be used quite shortly afterwards.
Yeah, and brake temperatures can get up to seriously high temperatures. I've seen brake temperatures, in excess of 500 degrees on occasions.
Yeah, it's pretty hot.
It's pretty hot.
Yeah, great question, Ray. Thanks very much for that one. And I think, Si, that's about all we've got time for this episode. So thanks again to everyone for sending your questions in. Please do keep them coming in. It's great to hear from you all.
Yeah, we'll speak to you soon. For now, keep it down to earth with Cruise Altitude.
Thanks for listening to Cruise Altitude. Don't forget to subscribe via your favourite podcast provider, leave us a review and get in touch via Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. Links can be found over on our website, cruisealtitude.com. A down-to-earth podcast from Cruise Altitude.